One of the things you've been particularly interested in recently is these deep cold water corals. Can you tell me what they are? Most people will never have heard of them.
Well, sure. Well, I often think of these deep cold water corals as the unsung heroes of the deep. And everybody knows about tropical corals and how much biodiversity they support. And exactly the same is true for these deep cold water coral reefs. But because they can live so deep, down to 3,000 meters, people just don't know about them. But they support huge amounts of biodiversity, and they are rainforests of the deep, just like the tropical coral reefs are as well.
And of course, tropical coral reefs people will know about, but we have these around our own coasts.
We do. So we've got them off the west coast of Scotland, so just by the Outer Hebrides. But as we go out further west, we'll see more and more out there. And so all around the North Atlantic as well, there's lots of these cold water corals. They are less colourful than the tropical ones, but they still do have a lot of colour. So most of the corals are white because they have no need for the pigments, and in fact they don't photosynthesize like the tropical corals, so they don't need the brown, they don't have the brown algae living inside them. But we still get oranges and reds and all sorts of fantastic colours, but overall less colourful than the tropical ones.
If they're not taking advantage of those the algae that give the tropical corals their colour, what are they feeding on?
Well, they actually have to catch passing prey items, so zooplankton and phytoplankton. So you can think of a coral like an anemone with a skeleton. So it's catching with its tentacles prey items as it comes past all the time. And this is a big unknown for us. So these corals, they are reliant upon this food which they get. And we don't know what their food source is going to be like in the future. And we know from the tropical coral literature that if you give corals more food, they build up their fat reserves, they're better able to withstand all sorts of stress. But if we imagine that these food sources maybe are not as high quality in the future or start to decrease, the corals will have less energetic reserves in which to survive and actually fend off stressful environments. So ocean acidification is a big threat to these cold water corals, and actually arguably I think it's more of a threat to these cold water coral reefs than to the tropical reefs, simply because they live so deep. And they live very close to this depth in the water where calcium carbonate, which is what they form their skeletons out of, becomes undersaturated. So below this depth, unprotected calcium carbonate can start to dissolve. And because the corals live very close to this depth, and this depth is predicted to become shallower and shallower and shallower over the next 100 years, they are at threat in a big way from ocean acidification. If you go down to one of these deep reefs, you'll see the top of it, which is live white and orange coral, and then below that is all dead coral. So these live corals are literally standing on the shoulders of their parents and their grandparents. But it's this dead coral which is also providing this enormous habitat for all sorts of biodiversity, so all sorts of nooks and crannies for everything to live in. So when we think about cold water coral ecosystems and how they can support biodiversity, we need to think about the live and the dead parts of it. What we found from our research, we've done the longest term multi-stressor research on these cold water corals to date, and we found these hidden impacts upon both the live and the dead skeleton. And so it's good news in a way that we know that corals can acclimate to future conditions and they can continue to grow. But now we know that the way they grow is very different. So they start to lay down their skeleton in very, very different ways. And this indicates to us that they're reducing the amount of energy they put into producing their skeleton into just surviving. And so this may have implications on how they can survive over the long term. But that's only part of it. And we're very worried about what's going to happen to the dead exposed skeleton, which actually supports the coral. And so once the coral tissue comes away from the skeleton, so once the coral is dead, this calcium carbonate skeleton is just open to the seawater, and that actually starts to dissolve in ocean acidification conditions. And as that starts to dissolve, the coral actually gets weaker and weaker, and we found that this coral actually gets about 20 to 30% weaker. And if you can imagine, if you were living in a house, if somebody told you that the base of your house is going to be 30% weaker, you'd call in the engineers, you'd want to do something about it now. But this is what's going to be happening to these cold water coral reefs. For some of these corals, they are already living at this depth in which calcium carbonate becomes undersaturated, so they will very shortly become in corrosive seawaters to their skeletons. And at the moment, I think 95% of cold water reefs live above this layer, but by the end of the century, this is expected to only be 30%. So the majority of these cold water reefs will be in this corrosive water. And if this happens, if we actually weaken the foundation, it may mean that the reefs may actually start falling in on themselves. So if you start to take away some of these reefs, or if they degrade, as we do indeed think they will, then you'll have less biodiversity support, which will feed up the food chain effectively, so we will start to notice those effects at the surface as well.